The students and our two friends were not at all excited about the prospect of riding these animals. Dick said that he was not surprised at all, because the professor of magic combat is known in Kizen for being a weirdo. He had even heard that she camps in different parts of the Roque Mountains. Simon couldn't quite believe it. Some of the students began to resent the fact that they had to ride it, even though the hippos looked friendly enough. But the noble students demanded that they put a rug or something on the animal's back before they got on. But the man who brought the hippos here was not at all happy with this attitude and began to gather darkness around his feet. And then he jumped incredibly high with a flip in the air under the admiring gazes of the students. And he began to land directly on that disgruntled nobleman who was shocked by this turn of events. And the man landed right on top of him, driving him into the ground. The others began to complain about what he had done. How could he stand in their way? They were Kizen students. How dare he be so brazen? The man asked again, a servant? He angrily told them how uneducated the new students were these days. He told the already frightened students that they should call him Ta, not servant. The students began to nervously apologize, especially the one on the ground. Simon, watching this scene, commented that they don't change, do they? Dick completely agreed with him and added that he was an exception to the nobility. After dealing with the impudent nobles, the man told everyone that they were a little behind schedule, so everyone had to get on the hippos quickly. One hippo could carry 3 students, and our two friends immediately chose one and began to get on it, some more successfully, some less. Dick finally managed to get on the back and sit behind Simon and whined about how big these hippos were and how difficult it was to climb them. Simon noticed a little girl trying to climb on their animal as well. While she was trying to climb, their guide saw that almost everyone could see and was about to give the animals the command to move. Simon asked her if she needed help and offered her his hand to help her up. She grabbed his hand and was very grateful for the help. Simon quickly lifted her up and sat her down in front of him. The guide told them to hold on tight. And he commanded the hippos, let's go. They quickly ran off with the students on their backs, kicking up clouds of smoke. During this fast trip, the girl Simon helped tried to thank him, but because of the speed and stomping, she only gave Simon a few slaps with her hair and he heard nothing. The other students were in no better shape, almost falling over and wondering what they had to hold on to. The man advised them to overcome this test with a strong will, because this was also part of the test. And he smilingly reminded them that if they fell, the hippos running after them would trample them and they would die. This seemingly logical message only made the students have more questions. Ta continued to frighten the students by telling them that every year there are 1 or 2 accidents in which students die. Frightened, they began to beg for help, demanding that he stop and let them get down to the ground. But Ta was relentless and told them to just keep going, because Kizen doesn't need students who can't hold on to a hippo. Finally, they arrived at a clearing in the mountains, and after such an intense trip, all the students were lying on the grass and were glad to be alive. One of the professor's assistants walked among them and offered each of them a bottle of water. The students were so exhausted that some of them could not even say thank you properly. What a grueling start to the class. Simon, Dick and their new friend sat together on the grass and drank water from the bottles, and it was really nice for them to relax and drink some water after such a trip. But suddenly the girl noticed that birds were flying overhead, which worried her a little bit. And the birds didn't just come for no reason. Someone came up to them and greeted them, saying, "Welcome to my class, everyone." The friends almost choked on their water from this voice, and the water stood up in their throats. The professor had a bird sitting on her shoulder, which also greeted the students with joy. The professor greeted them and introduced herself. Her name was Hongping Tun Soka Marlat. She smilingly informed them that she would be teaching their magic combat class this semester and punched her chest to confirm. A bit of history. This is what the giant undead monster that burned 4 feudal lords to the ground looked like and was called Kunder Hydra. It was this monster that Hongping fought. Professor Hongping is a legend among necromancers because she once fought a mega undead monster for 5 days and she broke all of its 100 necks by herself to win a dramatic victory. And now she was teaching the new generations of necromancers how to fight magically. Now she asked all the students to stand up and to line up in a column of Vurs. But the students did not understand what she wanted from them and what the word Vurs meant. One of the assistants came to their aid and explained that the professor meant that they should line up in columns of 4 and move quickly. It was only then that the students realized what was being asked of them. When they lined up, the professor said that it was good and now they would go now, but this time the students had questions about where to go. But she didn't answer them and quickly ran down the slope without waiting for anyone. leaving a bunch of confused students behind. But after a moment of hesitation, they were all running after her, as she told them that they should have a sound mind and a sound body. And that the basis of magic combat begins with physical fitness. The students watched her with admiration and agreed that she was incredible and wondered how she could run like that. Simon thought that they also had 2 arms and 2 legs, but their professor was on a completely different level. She continued that the basis of the subject of magical combat is to enhance one's body with darkness and learn combat strategies that their body can use. But there was something strange in her pronunciation of the words, and so the students who ran after her did not understand everything she said. The professor was saying that necromancers who mainly use magic combat are called the battle necromancers. If they reach a certain level of training, the darkness will flow over their bodies as softly as silk. It will also form something similar in shape to a garment that necromancers call the dark robe. This is the very skill that characterizes combat necromancers, and she also warned them to be careful, because of the large number of trees ahead. Poor Dick, who was not used to moving around so much, whined about how he envied the children who had a talent for magical combat. Simon, who looked a little better than him, asked, "Talented kids?" He looked around and saw students running and jumping through trees as if gravity were a joke. And he agreed with Dick that it seemed that while they were suffering here, those students seemed to be having fun. Dick could barely stand up and sweat was pouring down his face. He asked Simon if he was okay. And he answered that yes, he was fine. This answer surprised his friend, who asked him how he could still be fine. Simon told him with a smile that he also had many mountains in his country and it was fun to run around in the mountains like he used to. Dick told him that he was a monster and he was so jealous of him. They kept running until they came to a huge chasm with water raging at the bottom. Professor Humping explained to them that now their task would be to jump over the gap in front of them using the darkness. One of the students hesitantly asked if they really had to jump over it. Humping said they could do it using one little trick. Just as they were collecting the darkness in their palms, they could instead direct it into their souls. And she was going to show them an example. So she asked them to be careful. The darkness enveloped her souls before she jumped. And she jumped vertically high up the hill under the astonished gazes of the students. But that wasn't all, she added that if you direct the darkness to your souls several times, you can do this. She moved like a shadow and did somersaults and several sideways movements, as if gravity did not affect her at all. She asked if they could see everything, but there was only silence. Simon and Dick were mesmerized by her movements and just stood there with their mouths open in amazement. She continued, emphasizing to them that as they jumped, they should direct all the darkness they had gathered to their feet as if they were going to spray it from their feet. It should feel as if they were pushing off that darkness and it was pushing them forward. And they jumped from one edge of the gap to the other seemingly without effort or problem, landing on the other side and stopping. She invited all the students to jump with her, but there was not much enthusiasm among them. But some students were brave enough to run to the abyss first. They jumped confidently, as if they had already practiced and had the ability to do so. In a moment, they were on the other side. Some of them landed successfully on their feet, others only managed to grab the edge of the cliff. However, the professor praised all of them for their good work. For those who did not succeed, she explained that if they released the darkness too late it could be dangerous. As it was now, she advised them to release the darkness earlier next time and lifted those hanging on the edge by the hand. Simon repeated to himself in concentration, "Push back on the darkness, push back on the darkness." Dick advised him not to overthink it. Simon objected that it seemed too complicated for him. But his friend assured him that overthinking only makes things more difficult and ran to the edge of the cliff, ready to jump. Simon advised him to be careful, but he jumped right away. As he jumped, a shadow flew right over him. It was our old friend and Simon's sworn enemy, Hector, and he jumped much higher than Dick. The two landed with mixed success. Hector's friends immediately began to congratulate him for the highest jump of all. Dick sat on the ground and dusted himself off, thinking to himself that he didn't like this Hector at all and was getting on his nerves. Simon was one of the last to dare to jump, his friend supporting him as best he could from the other side, telling him that Simon could do it, because even he had done it. Simon was still concentrating on preparing for the jump, repeating the professor's instructions. Finally, he felt ready and ran forward. He jumped and gathered all his darkness in his souls and pushed off. Even Hector and his henchmen had to notice how high Simon had jumped, and they had been waiting for him to fail. He was still flying over the cliff when Dick shouted at him that it was incredible. Simon finally landed and everyone began to congratulate him on his wonderful jump. Dick was especially happy that he had wiped Hector's nose. Simon was over the moon. He shouted with joy, "I did it." Even Professor Hongpeng was amazed and stunned by his jump, not to mention the other students. Almost everyone was happy for him and congratulated him. It was a real victory for him and he could not contain his joy. However, his joy was not shared by everyone. Hector gritted his teeth and furiously held back everything inside him. His hatred for this Simon, who had already beaten him for the second time, was growing more and more. The professor happily announced that everyone seemed to have crossed the chasm, but they had to wait for the students who had fallen a little bit down, and as soon as they got up to them, they would all go to a new area to continue the lesson. Simon was beaming with happiness and answered her happily, "Yes, Professor." On the way back, Dick turned to Simon and asked him, holding out the book, if he wanted to check it out. Dick looked at the book and asked with interest what it was. When he opened the book he replied that it was a list of students they had to recruit for the group classes that were to start next week. Dick also added that he thought they should start preparing now. In addition, he had already listed and written down everyone's names, strengths, and characteristics in a notebook. Looking at the notes in his friend's notebook, Simon asked with surprise and admiration how he had been able to research all this. To which he replied that it was a trade secret. Watching his friend's joyful face as he continued to talk excitedly in his notebook, Simon couldn't help but notice that while he struggled to keep up with his lectures, Dick managed to find time to observe others even during class. It was clear to him at that moment why he had come to him and not to Hector, for after observing him he had come to the conclusion that he could not get along with him. Turning to Dick, Simon asked him what his opinion was based on the results of the study. He hid his notebook and replied that most of the students in their class were highly qualified, and all of them were pretty good, but, pointing to the pink-haired girl who rode the hippo with them, Dick noted that she might be expelled as soon as the protective period expired. Adding that there were only 2 kids in their class who couldn't jump over the abyss, and this girl was one of them. She was also very shy, which could lead to bullying. Suddenly, a loud voice was heard from Professor Hongpeng, who started running and shouted to the students to follow her as they were already delayed. The tired students who were hoping for a break sighed pitifully. Simon, saying that this class was so fun and dynamic, followed her with eager eyes, while Dick, who did not particularly share his enthusiasm, marveled once more at his friend's fervor. The next instant, however, something caught Simon's eye. Suddenly a pack of hippopotamuses appeared in the distance and rushed toward the students, creating dust and vibrations on the ground. When some students saw this, they immediately reported it to Professor Hongpeng, hoping that she would be able to help them. However, to their confusion, it was as if the professor had fallen underground and she was nowhere to be found. Realizing this and seeing a herd of hippos running straight at them, the students panicked. Realizing the pitifulness of the situation, Simon noted that it was very bad and something had to be done. Standing in front of the hippos that were about to reach him, he gathered the darkness in his legs. Then at the last moment he jumped high into the air in front of the hippo. Remembering Dick's words that they would not be in any danger during the students' defense period, he was confused, for he could not understand whether it was all a setup or not. Still in the air, he concluded that if someone could not dodge, he would probably be badly hurt. However, as it turned out, his worries were in vain. The students were able to avoid the bull's attack without any problems. Some cast a curse of exhaustion, others blocked the attack with a shield or simply climbed into trees where they were out of range of the behemoths. Dropping to the ground near Simon suddenly appeared Cindy, who greeted him with a smile on her face. As he landed and realized that it was too early for him to play hero and worry about others, Simon heard someone call out to him. It was Dick, hanging from the pole, who asked him if he was all right, to which Simon nodded affirmatively. There were some worries, however, that he had underestimated his classmates, and now he realized that in the future he would have to compete with thousands of them. Seeing his friend's downcast look, Dick told him not to worry too much about anything, for all these behemoths were under the control of Professor Hongpeng. Adding that she was a master of magical combat, but could also use the druid bloodline. When he was on top, he saw the hippos running around the guys who had fallen to the ground. Simon was a bit surprised by this information as he thought things had gotten out of hand. The instructor arrived and said that the guys had no time to sit around and should get up and start moving. They sighed with fatigue and started to rise to their feet. The instructor kept pushing the students, motivating them by the fact that the hippopotamuses were going back soon, and also adding that the professor was waiting for all of them downstairs. The pink-haired girl staggered to her feet with tears in her eyes and stood up abruptly, saying excitedly that she understood. A light breeze blew between the trees. The students ran out of the forest and into a clearing, the beauty of which took everyone's breath away, and with wide open and amazed eyes, they all stared at the picture before their eyes. In the middle of the clearing dotted with flowers stood their Hongping professor, who said that there were no more obstacles and called them to her. With delight, all the students rushed to run to her through the incredibly beautiful green meadow, the beauty of which overwhelmed everyone with excitement. When everyone had arrived, the professor said that now they could rest. Then remembering something added that despite the fact that they were supposed to eat only after a glass, she considering how tired they were had contacted Kizan in advance. The students were puzzled, but everything became immediately clear after the professor pointed her finger at something. It was lunch, which was delivered to the students right there. When the professor asked what her idea was, the students broke out into joyous shouts saying that it was the best. Sitting in the lotus posture and holding the tray of food on his lap, Dick noted that Professor Hongping was not like the others. Feeding students in her own class was not what one would expect from all the other strict teachers. However, Simon had a question about this very thing. Even before entering the academy, he had heard a slightly different opinion. Namely that Professor Hongping was one of the most typical professors at Kizan. To which Dick contemptuously asked where Simon had heard this nonsense. He answered nothing, thinking to himself that Lorraine would probably not have deceived him. Their conversation was interrupted by the professor, who turned to the students and told them that they had to finish. Some of the students were surprised to be leaving this beautiful place so soon. But Simon had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something. Turning to the students who had gathered in front of her, Professor Hongping asked if they had the bracelets she had given them, to which they amicably replied that they did. She then told the students to let the darkness penetrate them. This action caused the students to immediately feel incredibly heavy and weak, and some of them even fell to their knees not understanding what was going on. The professor, with a smile on her face, pointed to the man with the flag behind her and asked the students if they were all familiar with the curse of exhaustion. She then informed them that their assignment would be to climb the hill with the curse of weakness on it, adding that everyone should be prepared. Then, with a devilish smile on her face, she turned to the students and added that she would be watching them closely. Unable to believe Professor Hongping's new assignment, the weary students didn't want to do another assignment so difficult. Unfortunately, however, they didn't have much of a choice. The next moment, the professor ordered everyone to take their seats. The slumped students, being under the curse of weakening, lined up in a row, barely able to stand on their feet. After the students lined up, Professor Hongping started counting down. The very next moment, she commanded to begin, and the students immediately rushed to run up the mountain towards the flag. After a while, however, the run turned into a very slow walk, each step of which was very difficult. The farther up the hill the students climbed, the closer to the ground they became, some of them even went on all fours. Shaking hands grasped the grass, rocks, and anything else they could grab onto. Simon was no exception, and crawled through the grass like the others. Every step was difficult, and he felt dizzy. But it was nothing compared to the preparatory training, and it was all about endurance and willpower. So he could not give up now, because then he would no longer be able to catch up with the pace of the next classes and would be left behind forever, and that was the decision he made. I will do it no matter what, Simon said to himself in a firm voice as he prepared himself for the challenge he had to overcome. Hector, who was also climbing on all fours and who was only a little taller than Simon, saw him catching up with him and snorted irritably, as he could once again prevent him from taking the first place. He was angry and surprised that even though he had weakened the fatigue spell with his own techniques to get ahead, Simon had managed to keep up with him even without any tricks. But Hector wasn't about to give up. And with more speed he decided that this time he would definitely win. Standing at the top of the mountain, Professor Hongping cheered up the guys telling them that they were almost there. Hector and Simon were ahead of them, crawling on all fours, and they were crawling to the finish line with all their might. And each of them was not going to lose to the other. Holding out their hands they said to themselves that this time they would definitely take first place. But their hopes were not to be realized. A foot stepped in front of their outstretched arms. It was none other than Maylene Willen. She walked lightly to the flag as if not feeling the fatigue. Professor Hongping immediately announced that she had won first place, while Simon and Hector stared at the girl with shocked looks, not understanding how this could be. After congratulating the girl on her victory, Professor Hongping asked her what she had done to walk as if there was no curse on her. To which she replied that she had simply unlocked the resistance formula of the fatigue curse. A little surprised and praising the girl, the professor told the one that she could rest. Hearing this, Simon and Hector were even more shocked, as they didn't know that breaking the curse wasn't forbidden by the rules. Suddenly one of the assistants turned to the professor and told him that they had a student with a sprained ankle, to which she immediately replied that she would take a look. She waved goodbye and congratulated them on being almost there and headed off to help, leaving Simon at a loss. With an annoyed sigh, Hector got to his feet and headed up the hill, saying irritably that he must be being bullied. After he climbed the mountain, the professor's assistant immediately informed him that he had won second place. Simon was left sitting on the ground not knowing what to do. Hector approached Mei Lin, who was sitting under a tree. He asked her in an annoyed voice why she had broken the curse even though they were in a magic class, adding that she wasn't the only one who could do it. However, the girl looked away and said she didn't care what he said. But Hector didn't want to be ignored and said that she really didn't know anything about the world, since she lived like a princess imprisoned in a tower. Mei Lin looked at him and asked him if he wanted to fight her. He replied that he had no intention of doing so, but was only telling her the truth, saying that professors don't evaluate them during the defense period. However, during that time it's important to show that you're doing well to get attention. Adding that what she just did will most likely only take away Professor Hongpeng's trust. Not intending to be lectured by him, the girl mockingly asked if he was so hurt by the defeat that he decided to take it out on her. He replied that he was just telling her to stay out of his way. Then turning around and intending to leave, he added that he had no interest in her at all. At the same moment, the instructor handed Simon, who had crawled to the finish line, a bottle of water and told him that he had taken third place. With a sigh of relief he leaned against a tree and sat down on the ground. Mei Lin and Hector, who were nearby, immediately looked at him. They stood silently waiting for the other participants to arrive. Falling on the grass beside Simon, Dick, tired and worn out, complained to his friend that he felt as if he were going to die. He praised him, saying that he had done a good job, adding that he was tired too. Looking up at the sky, catching flashbacks of the day's events, Dick asked Simon what he thought about how they were going to get home. And would they have to climb the hippopotamuses again, adding that if they did, it would be better to bite their tongues off and not suffer. Suddenly Professor Hongpeng turned to the students again, mispronounced a word. She told them to gather together. There was a magic circle on the ground in front of the students gathered in a pile. Professor Hongpeng explained that since everyone looked very tired, she had contacted the academy again and was allowed to use the teleportation magic circle. Then she told everyone to get in line. The surprised and tired students were incredibly happy about this gift. Simon and Dick waited for their turn to enter the circle. Simon was surprised to see that the teleportation sensations were new to him. However, the landing after teleportation was quite painful, as his landing spot was a wooden table, which he landed on with a shriek and a thud. Rubbing his back and not seeing the familiar surroundings, he wondered where he had gotten to, as he didn't think he had gotten to the academy. However, a voice confirmed his hunch, saying that he had indeed gotten to the wrong place. The voice apologized to him for scaring him. Recognizing the voice, Simon turned around and was surprised to see Professor Hongpeng, who turned to him and told him to sit down, adding that she would explain why he was here. Without waiting for Simon to sit down, the professor informed him that the magic circle had been modified in some unknown way, and after examining it, it became known that someone had added a formula to make it react to the darkness of a particular person. Heading towards the table, Simon asked in a surprised voice, was it really him? The professor handed him a metal mug and said that it was, so when the circle was activated it didn't go to Kazan. Pouring water from the kettle into the cup, she asked him if he had any idea who could have done it. He replied confusedly that he had no idea who it could be. Laughing, Professor Hongpeng told him not to worry, because her job was to protect the students, and that was why he had come to her house. However, she added that she wanted to talk to him personally, which surprised him. Putting her hands together, the professor said that it was against the rules to talk to students during the defense period, but from what she had seen there were already professors who had broken that rule. Simon Valencia. She turned to Simon, who replied excitedly. Don't you want to choose magical combat as your profile? She asked, looking at the boy. She added that if he wanted to she would be willing to take him on as an apprentice. A little puzzled, Simon asked if it meant that he would become her personal student. Professor Hongpeng replied that it was correct, saying that she would be responsible for his training since professors treat their students with full seriousness and responsibility. She added that the performance of direct students was directly related to the professor's reputation, so they could only choose 3 students from each year. She looked at Simon and said that this was the opportunity she wanted to give him. She held out her hand and asked the confused boy if he was ready to be her student. He asked Professor Hongping why she had offered it to him, because he had not done well in class today. He could hardly keep up with the other students, and he could only come third on the hill. Besides, today was only the second day of school, so he was sure that her decision to offer him such a thing was not well thought out. The professor, however, folded her hands in front of her with a smile on her face and told him that rankings might be important to students, but professors looked at talent. Then she reminded him of the moment when they jumped over the river using darkness and asked him if it was the first time he had ever used darkness. To which he replied that she was right. To which the professor replied that even though it was the first time he had used darkness, he had jumped higher than all the students in the class, which was no longer a matter of talent or coincidence. In addition, when climbing the hill he only used his stamina and willpower, unlike those two. Then she added, looking at the confused Simon, that even if he thought he hadn't demonstrated anything, he was mistaken, for it was enough for her. When she finished she asked him with a smile if he wanted more compliments. Without waiting for an answer, she continued, saying that his stamina, thinking and incredible talent in using darkness were the best for choosing magic combat. Adding that they were so good that he would surpass even her in a couple years. But even that wasn't the limit, the professor said with confidence in her voice that if she trained him she could make him stronger than anyone. Simon sitting on the chair listened to Professor Hongpeng's words carefully. He turned to her and thanked her for her generosity in offering to be his student. However, he bowed low and said that he would like to decline. She immediately asked him the reason. Simon replied in a slightly guilty voice that he would like to study another field more deeply at the moment. Upon hearing the answer, Professor Hongpeng smiled and said that it was fine, adding that she was grateful to him for telling her right away so that she wouldn't have any more questions. However, she added that her agreement did not mean that she would give up on working with him. Hearing this, Simon asked in surprise what she meant. The professor replied that she had already told him about the profile, so she would try her best to change his mind. Simon was surprised at her determination, so he asked her why she was going so far. She replied that it was just personal curiosity, adding that she just wanted to see how strong he could grow. With a wave of her hand that left a blue magical glow behind her, she said that it wasn't just about him becoming her apprentice. Adding that he could come to her for help whenever he wanted. Illuminated by the bright magical glow that made him squint his eyes, Simon thanked the professor. Having finished creating the teleportation circle, Professor Hongpeng turned to Simon and told him that she didn't want him to tell anyone about the dialogue. She added that the circle had transported him to Kaizen, to which he smiled and replied that he was glad. Waving goodbye, she said with a smile that she would see him at the next class. Stepping onto the teleportation circle, and turning to the professor, Simon said goodbye with a smile on his face. She looked at the guy as he walked away and thought about something, but she didn't hear the voice calling her. The next moment the door opened and the professor's assistant came into the room and asked her how it went. To which she replied that he had refused. Hearing this, the man immediately became indignant, asking how the guy dared to refuse her, and then he suggested the professor to take Hector as a student, who in his opinion was more talented in magical combat. But he was interrupted by the professor, saying only 2 words, "He's a genius." The assistant standing at the door questioned what she meant. She folded her arms across her chest and said that she had seen many geniuses in Kaizen, but she'd never met one like this. He opened the bathroom door. Simon walked in and met Dick, who was toweling his head. He immediately asked him why he'd come in so late. Simon replied that there had been a problem with his teleportation. Realizing that he was all right, Dick said enthusiastically that Simon had no idea what had just happened to him. Not understanding why his friend was so excited, Simon asked what had happened. He replied that when he teleported into the circle, there was a rumbling noise that froze his body. And after he came to himself, he found himself in a completely unfamiliar place. As it turned out, he found himself in the office of Professor Bahil, who was sitting in his chair emitting an eerie aura. Surprised, Simon asked Dick if it was the same professor from the Department of Catarology, and he proudly replied that it was. Simon asked him what had happened afterwards, wanting to hear the rest of the story. Dick replied that afterward the professor had made him clean his office. In spite of what he was doing, Dick's eyes lit up with joy, because according to the Kaizen alumni, professors often guide students in this way. Adding that this was probably what had happened to him and he probably had a chance to be his student. When he realized this, he started jumping up and down and shouting about how cool it was to be a direct student of the professor, because he could enjoy his school life, and if he was a direct student of the professor, he could avoid even being expelled. Simon tried to calm down his restless friend. But he clenched his hand into a fist and said that he couldn't calm down so easily. Hector, who had heard the noise Dick had made, said it was the stupidest nonsense he had ever heard, adding scornfully that a pathetic commoner like him would never be a direct student of Professor Bahil. Hearing the boy's contemptuous words, Dick mockingly asked him if he was so hurt by the words, asking if it was because the professors weren't looking at more than just him. Being angry at the guy's words, Hector said in an irritated voice to watch his words. However, Dick was not going to back down, saying that he had seen the likes of him many times before. Then he added in a mocking voice that he had heard that he had almost fought with Mei Lin in the magic combat class. Then he added that they were equals in this place, so he advised him to stop pretending that he had an advantage because he was trained by the Moore family. He then said that it was probably not Mei Lin who didn't know how the world worked, but him. These words made Hector furious. In the next moment, a large red magic circle appeared in his hand, which was aimed directly at Dick. As a result, many strands of red magic smoke coiled around the guy's body, which, judging by the expression on Dick's face, brought him quite a lot of pain. Simon rushed to his friend, asking what was wrong with him. But Hector did not plan to stop there. He lifted Dick off the ground with his magic and called him a pathetic piece of trash. He slammed him against the wall, angrily asking how he dared to treat him like that. Then he stared at him with a fierce look of murderous intent. He said in a furious voice that he would kill him. Then he intensified his attack and started choking the guy even harder. Simon, who had been standing aside all this time, did not rush at Hector as you might think. No, he just shouted Dick's name in a panic. He grinned despite the pain of the curse. Then gave him the middle finger and mockingly said he could try. One of Hector's friends, who realized that something irreparable might happen, grabbed his hand and asked him to calm down and not to cross the line, as it was forbidden to use magic outside of lessons. However, with a single blow of his hand, telling them to shut up, he threw him and another guy backward, causing them to fall to the ground. However, in the next instant he sensed something and looked with his eyes that were like Naruto's that were under the control of the nine-tailed fox in the direction from where the danger was felt. Despite the suddenness of the attack, he managed to block the blow, which was delivered by none other than Simon, who stopped dumbfounded and came to his senses and rushed to save his friend. However, this was not unexpected for Hector, who was just waiting for him to jump into the fray. Simon covered his friend with his hands and glared angrily at Hector. Simon punches Hector, but he blocks. Despite that punch being powerful, he slid back, holding his stance. He said that he was expecting Simon to intervene at some point. The curse weakened Dick, so he could not stay at his feet. Simon stood before him, determined to defend his friend. Hector started forming darkness in his hand. He was finally going to show everybody who is strongest here. But when he almost formed the curse, the thrown brick of soap shattered it. They turned their heads and saw Kajin. He looked ominous. He had only a towel cinched around his waist so they could see his muscular upper body with scars. He commanded them to keep it down, warning that he would break their necks if they did not. Hector ignored that and wondered how Kajin was still staying in school. His friends were terrified. They heard rumors that that guy got suspended for beating up other kids. However, Hector couldn't be easily scared and threatened Kajin to watch out. He added that he will not let things slide like this again. At this moment, the guys behind Kajin thanked him for help. But he turned back to go out, telling them to shut up and left, slamming the door. Simon remarked that Kajin is a good person despite his appearance. Dick completely agreed with him. Dick inquired about Simon's weekend plans, to which Simon replied that he had none. Dick explained to Simon that spending weekends with a goal in mind is super important. For example, the weekend schedule is more important for him than weekday classes. He is going to Rachet, a town below the school's land, to make a business there. Money is vital for successfully graduating from Kizen. Despite the school paying living expenses for students, it's not nearly enough to advance to higher grades. Dick would like an academic scholarship for extra money but couldn't get the required high grades. So, he would use his special abilities as early as possible to earn money. He also advised Simon to figure out how to earn extra cash. Professors aren't going to give out in-class materials for free like now once the student protection period ends. The money you get from school isn't enough to buy all the needed materials. So, all upperclassmen have their ways of earning money. And also, because of Simon's interest in summonology, he needs money the most. For this scholarship, students need a lot of expensive materials. Simon replied that he never thought they needed to be self-sufficient in extracurricular activities to survive in school. This thing startled him. Dick offered that he establishes himself in Rocha's town so he would be able to arrange some job for Simon. But Simons told him that he must learn to make money independently. Dick gathered all the needed things and said he was going out to take care of tomorrow's schedule. But Simon worried that then was a late hour and what would be if the headmaster caught Dick. Dick told him that despite the strictness of school, they respected autonomy, so it was okay as long as he didn't get caught. Dick left, and Simon remained alone. He was sitting, eating snacks, and thinking what to do right now. Suddenly, someone appeared outside of the window. He had heard sounds, turned his head, and saw Archbold glancing at him from the window. He opened the window for her and asked how she got there on the 4th floor. She didn't give a serious answer and just climbed into the room. They sat together in the room, and he treated her to snacks. She was happy to have them because she couldn't eat sweets at home. She asked how his first time at school was. He told her it was fun because the professors were incredible, everyone was nice, and the classes were fun. He thinks that he is well suited for this school. Despite a bit of struggle at first with help from friends, he got used to it. She light-mindedly replied that she thought he might suffer a lot because he arrived at school without learning anything beforehand. Nephthys told him their conversation reminded her of when Richard studied at the same place. Simon couldn't believe that his father was also a Kizen school student. She said that Richard was no joke and that although I seemed very mature, he was quite the troublemaker and a walking disaster. On top of that, he was too clever for his own good. He used to get himself into trouble by mocking the professors and attempting to skip classes. On several occasions, he had to be physically brought back to class to ensure he didn't miss out on important lessons. Simon couldn't believe what he'd heard. Father, who he knew was completely different. So he asked Nephthys Archbold if his father graduated from school and was shocked to hear that he dropped out. She said that the school was too small for such exceptional student. She described him as a special case in many ways. Being young at that time, she couldn't handle him that well. Nephthys plopped down on the bed on her back, remembering her youth. And then she suddenly got up from bed while saying that his father practically turned the whole Roke Island upside down. So, if Simon looks closely, he might find traces of his father. She advised him to pay close attention to that for a more enjoyable school life. And then she told him she should leave because she had a schedule. When she climbed out the window, she thanked him for the snacks and left him origami. Unfolded origami turned out to be a map with his location and skull drawn as a destination by a dashed line. He remembered what she told him about his father's deeds and decided that this map somehow connected. He walked in the forest at night. It was filled with owls' hoots and other scary sounds. Simon already wasn't sure that it was a good idea.